When you hear about a potential conflict between the United States and China, your mind probably jumps to missiles, aircraft carriers, and a future hot war. But what if I told you the real conflict is already happening? Not on the open seas, but in our supply chains. And it's not being fought with gunfire, but with computer chips and tariffs. So the question is, how did we get here? And where is this all headed? To figure that out, we've got to look at this rivalry piece by piece.
So, here's our game plan. First, we're going to unpack an ancient Greek theory that's making a huge comeback. Then we'll look at why today's battlefield looks so different. After that, we'll dive into the actual weapons being used in this trade war. And finally, we'll explore whether there's any hope for what some are calling a cold peace.
All right, to get a real handle on today's headlines about tech bans and economic showdowns, we've actually got to go way back. I'm talking more than 2,000 years to ancient Greece, because that's where the core of this whole thing started, with a simple, powerful, and frankly, terrifying idea. And that brings us to this thing called the Thucydides Trap. It gets its name from an ancient historian, Thucydides, who was writing about a war that completely wrecked his world. And he noticed a pattern, a dangerous dynamic that he felt was almost destined to repeat. When a new, rising power starts to challenge the old, established power, that's when things get really, really dangerous. And this right here, this is the original case study, the Peloponnesian War. For Thucydides, the key wasn't just about land or money. It was about psychology. You had Athens, this dynamic, up-and-coming sea power with a booming economy, and then you had Sparta, the old guard, the dominant land power, who started getting really, really nervous. Thucydides wrote that the fear Athens' rise created in Sparta is what ultimately made the war inevitable.
And you can probably see where this is going, right? The parallel to our world today is, well, it's pretty striking. The United States is today's Sparta, the established global power for the better part of a century, and China is the new Athens, the ambitious, rising power whose incredible economic and technological growth is changing everything. The roles are set, the dynamic is the same. It's kind of eerie.
Okay, so this brings us to the central puzzle of this whole situation. If the ancient trap is set and the modern players are locked in their roles, why isn't this playing out like the wars of the past? Why does this conflict look so completely different? I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Given history, you'd expect to see naval blockades, maybe dogfights over the Pacific. So why aren't we seeing that? Well, the answer comes down to two gigantic factors that Thucydides could never have possibly imagined. First, of course, are nuclear weapons. They're the ultimate check on an all-out war. The price of that kind of conflict is just too high to even comprehend. But there's a second reason, and on a day-to-day basis, it might be even more powerful. Our economies are completely tangled up. A hot war between the U.S. and China wouldn't just be a military disaster. It would cause a global economic meltdown, wrecking the very prosperity both countries are trying to protect. So the conflict didn't just vanish. No way. It just morphed. It shifted arenas. The war is happening, but the battlefields are now digital, they're financial, and they're even psychological. Instead of fighting over territory, the fight is for control over supply chains, for who sets the tech standards for the next century, and for who controls the global story. So let's talk about the actual weapons being used in this 21st century showdown, because this isn't some abstract idea. We're talking about real, physical things that power our entire world, from our phones to our fighter jets. And what's fascinating here is the almost perfect symmetry of this fight. Think of it like this. The U.S. is attacking from the very top of the technology pyramid. It's blocking China's access to the most advanced, high-end semiconductor chips, the brains behind AI and future tech. And how does China respond? It attacks from the very bottom of that pyramid, controlling the export of the essential rare earth minerals that you need to build, well, pretty much everything. And make no mistake, China's leverage here is huge. It's not just about who has these minerals in the ground. It's about who can process them into a usable form. And right now, China processes a staggering 85% of the world's supply. That's a near monopoly, and it gives them an incredible chokehold on global manufacturing. And if you want a stat that really drives this point home, get this. A single F-35 fighter jet, the absolute crown jewel of American military tech, needs 417 kilograms of rare earth elements. Think about that. The U.S. military-industrial complex is fundamentally dependent on its #1 strategic rival. But this isn't just some abstract geopolitical game. It hits you and me right in the wallet. These tariffs, while they're aimed at China, end up acting like a tax on American consumers. Some estimates suggest they could add anywhere from $1,200 to $1,500 a year to the costs for an average household, on everything from your TV to your washing machine. Okay, so where does this all go? With both sides armed with these powerful economic weapons, are we just doomed to escalate? Well, this brings us to our last section, and maybe, just maybe, a small reason for some cautious optimism. And this gets to the single most important difference between this kind of conflict and an actual war. Economic pain, as bad as it can be, is reversible. You can lift tariffs, you can roll back sanctions, you can rebuild supply chains. But the destruction of war, that's forever. And that opens the door to this idea of a cold peace. It's not exactly friendly, right? It's a state of intense, long-term competition. Both sides are constantly jockeying for position using economic and political pressure, but there's a shared understanding that crossing the line into a real hot war would be mutually assured destruction for the very prosperity they're fighting over. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. We have to go back to what Thucydides said in the first place. The trap isn't just about rising power. It's about the fear that rise creates. This so-called cold peace is a super fragile balance. It could be tipped over at any moment by a miscalculation, by a surge of nationalism, or by that deeply human emotion that started it all, fear. And so that's the tightrope we're all walking now, isn't it? The Thucydides Trap is back, but it's been reimagined for our time. It's being fought with chips and minerals instead of swords and shields, but the core challenge is exactly the same as it was thousands of years ago. Can our leaders manage to turn that ancient fear into modern wisdom? Or is history's dangerous pattern about to repeat itself yet again? That is the test our world is facing right now.